This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you my limited archetype guide for Streets of New Capenna. Over the last week or so, I've given you my evaluations for every single card in this new set, and today I'm going to look at each of the limited archetypes in the format and discuss the synergies the various cards have. In most limited formats, every two-color combination has its own limited archetype, but this set is a bit different. The set's main focus is around the 5 3-color factions, one for each of Capenna's crime families. So each of those has a supported limited archetype, and those are sort of the primary archetypes. In addition to that, though, the 5 allied color pairs also have an archetype. However, the 5 enemy color pairs don't have a supported archetype. They did this because each of the allied color pairs overlaps with 2 separate crime families, and each of these color pairs combines synergies from 2 different families. This also means that you can start drafting 2 colors like most drafts before committing to a 3rd color. This generally means that you won't find yourself ending up in the 5 enemy colored combinations in the format except in some exceptional circumstances. In this video, I will address each of these 10 archetypes and discuss their internal synergies. This isn't a video where I'm going to talk about all the cards that are just really good, like premium removal or bombs, because this video is focused on cards that will be at their best in a particular archetype. If you want to know my thoughts on what the best cards in this set are in general, that's what the set review is for, and this Saturday I'll also put a video up giving my picks for the best commons and uncommons in the set, and Friday we'll have a top 10 about the biggest bombs in the format. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into the archetype guide, beginning with Cabaretti. Cabaretti is the red, green, white faction in the set, and they're all about going wide. As you can see from these 2 signpost uncommons, that is, uncommons that are these 3 colors exactly and sort of direct you in the direction of their synergy, we've got Brazen Upstart, which is a 3-mana 4/2 that when it dies, lets you reveal a creature card from the top of your library if it's in the top 5 and put it into your hand, and Rocco Cabaretti Caterer is an X-costed creature that can search up a creature with mana value X or less and put it directly onto the battlefield when it enters the battlefield. Both of these cards help you make sure you have a steady supply of creatures hitting the battlefield. And that goes pretty well with this archetype because there's lots of payoffs for going wide. Cabaretti Charm is another signpost uncommon, more or less. All 3 of its effects like you to have as many creatures as possible, or in the case of the 3rd effect, helps you get multiple creatures into play at once. And this all supports the Cabaretti mechanic, which is Alliance, or basically Creature Fall. When a creature enters the battlefield, you get some sort of effect, and this appears on creatures. So Sizzling Soloist, for example, makes a creature unable to block. And a lot of these triggers, as you'll see, do fairly aggressive things. And this is obviously an aggro deck with a bunch of creatures in it. Witty Roastmaster does 1 damage to the opponent anytime a creature enters. Celebrity Fencer gets a +1/+1 counter. Rumor Gatherer lets you scry, and if you do it 2 times in 1 turn, that is trigger Alliance, you get to straight up draw a card. Speakeasy Server gains you 1 life for each other creature you control. This isn't actually an Alliance card, but it does pay you off for going wide. Attended Socialite gets +1/+1 until end of turn with its Alliance trigger. Elegant Entourage gives +1/+1 and trample to another creature. Take to the Streets. This is a good payoff for going wide because you're going to be wanting to play as many creatures as possible anyway, including cards that make more than 1 body at a time. So this can help you close out a game. It also just so happens that a lot of the creatures in this pair, or I guess in this 3-color combination, are citizens, so they'll also get the additional boost. Venom Connoisseur gains Death Touch and can give Death Touch to your whole team if you trigger Alliance twice. For the Family is a nice combat trick that gets better the more creatures you have in play. Let's look now at some of the ways you can go wide. We've already seen Rocco and Brazen Upstart and Cabaretti Charm, but there's also Rakish Revelers. This makes 2 bodies and 1 card, and it can also fix for you early. Pugnacious Pugilist, another card that makes 2 separate bodies. When it attacks, it makes a devil. So that's 2 Alliance triggers, and you're also going wide to pump your whole board with Cabaretti Charm or To the Streets. Exhibition Magician can give you 2 bodies. Gathering Throng lets you search up other copies of it, ensuring that you can just get an Alliance trigger every turn. Mage's Attendant makes 2 bodies. And Patch Up can potentially allow you to get back multiple bodies by reanimating things. I do think it's probably a little more well-positioned in other decks, but it looks like it might have a home here. Here are the rares. So far we've looked at all the commons and uncommons. Those are what matter the most, but there are rares, of course, for this faction. You've got Fleetfoot Dancer. It doesn't actually do anything with going wide, but it is a super efficient creature in these colors. Ginny Fey, Jetmir's second, can make you replace all your creature token generators with better tokens, whether they're cat creature tokens with haste or green dog creatures with vigilance. Incandescent Aria is going to like it if you have a lot of ways to make creature tokens because it doesn't hurt your tokens. Jetmir is the leader of this faction, and he is definitely the best go-wide payoff in the whole format. He gives you all sorts of effects the wider you go. A lot of the time when you play him, he's going to give +2/+0, trample, and vigilance to your whole board, which is typically going to end the game. Devilish Valet has an alliance trigger. It doubles its power every time alliance is triggered. Extraction Specialist, this is a card that can work maybe a little better in a more graveyard-oriented deck. But if you trade with like a 2-drop early, play the Specialist, and reanimate that 2-drop, you do get 2 alliance triggers, and that's pretty sweet. Sanctuary Warden, this can crank out creature tokens by giving up counters on other creatures. Gala Greeters has a bunch of powerful alliance options. Parkite's Pegasus can draw you cards if you had 2 or more creatures into the battlefield on your turn. Halo Fountain, I mean, this is going to be good in pretty much any white deck, but it can crank out creature tokens, which this deck is interested in. Getaway Car, this is probably the best deck for it because you can bounce things to your hand to re-trigger Alliance. Rabble Rousing, this is the best deck for it. It's going to allow you to go insanely wide, and if you have a bunch of ways, a bunch of cards with Alliance, it's just going to be backbreaking if it wasn't already. And Cabaretti Ascendancy increases the chances of you hitting a creature card every turn to trigger your alliance. So that's the Cabaretti. They're about going wide. They're an aggressive deck. We're going to move from Cabaretti to looking at one of the allied color pairs contained within Cabaretti, and that's green-white. And I want to talk about it next because it's the deck that most resembles the Cabaretti, and it's also a deck that you can have a lot of these cards internally within the Cabaretti deck, and they're just as good. But this is one of those allied color pairs that has a little bit of support. As you can see, the signpost uncommon here is Darling of the Masses. It pumps all your citizens, and whenever she attacks, she makes another citizen. So she works really well with Alliance, and the focus within green-white is more on citizens in particular, and less on going wide more broadly. But obviously, elements from both of these decks can be in one another and work pretty well together. There are 3 citizen payoffs that are gold in these 2 specific colors. We've got the Darling of the Masses, which we just saw, the Ceremonial Groundbreaker, which equips to citizens really efficiently, and Civil Servant, which can tap an untapped citizen you control to get +1/+0 and lifelink. We've also got Take to the Streets, which we already saw, but it's going to be even better in a deck focused on citizens than it is in maybe a more broad Cabaretti deck, because you're going to have more citizens. Angelic Observer costs less the more citizens you control. And there's also Scuttling Butler. This doesn't say the word citizen on it, but I think this is the deck that is the most well-equipped to make this work, because all of these citizen tokens are gold. They're all both green and white, and that means it's pretty easy to get multiple multicolored creatures into play and get double strike going on Scuttling Butler. So that's green-white. It's about citizens. Again, it's sort of contained within the Cabaretti, but it can also be its own separate, more focused on citizens archetype. Let's move now to Maestros, which is the red, black, blue faction. This faction has sacrifice and spells as its primary theme. Cormella Glamour Thief, who you see on the left here, can add mana to your mana pool for instants and sorceries, but she's also a nice thing to sacrifice because she can give you back instants and sorceries from your graveyard. Corpse Appraiser doesn't say sacrifice or even do anything with spells, and so it's not immediately obvious as a signpost uncommon, but if you're sacrificing creatures, you're more likely to have a creature card in your graveyard so you can use its ability. Though keep in mind, it can even go after an opponent's graveyard, but in this deck, you're probably more likely to be the one to have a creature in your graveyard on like turn 3. And then the mechanic for the Maestros is Casualty, which you can see on a little chat here. So that mechanic itself embodies what this deck is about. It's about finding things to sacrifice to double your spells for great value. Like a little chat can allow you to pay 2 mana to look at the top 4 cards of your library and draw 2 cards, which is an amazing rate. We're not going to talk about every single card with Casualty. Suffice it to say there's a lot of them. I wanted to focus instead on the good sacrifice fodder. In other words, the things that you want to sacrifice to your Casualty spells. This is things like Expendable Lackey, who has a humorous name because that's really what he is. You can sacrifice him to one of your cards that has Casualty 1 to copy it, and then he can even make a copy from the graveyard and allow you to do something else with a card with Casualty 1. Similarly, Sleep with the Fishes gives you a creature while being a removal spell. That gives you a good thing to remove. that doesn't equal a full creature. And I mean, in an ideal world, when you're casting spells with casualty, you do not want to be giving up cards that are a full card. And that's why these two were good, because the value of each of these cards is divided between two different things. And that's the kind of thing you want. Broker's Veteran, in this case, you do end up sort of giving up a whole card, but because you can put a shield counter on something, you can sometimes get value out of sacrificing it. Crooked Custodian is another card where you do end up giving up a full card, but any 2-mana creature with 3 power, and there's a few of them in the set, any of them are pretty nice because they can allow you to copy some of the more powerful, more expensive casualty cards without giving up something that you really want to hold on to. And Crooked Custodian as a 2-mana 3/2 definitely isn't that. Maestro's Initiate, you can sacrifice this, but then it gives you value from the graveyard. Raffine's Silencer, when it dies, it can give -X/-X to things. Exhibition Magician, we saw this already, but just like it's good for going wide in the Cabaretti, the 2 bodies it gives you are good for casting spells with casualty. One of the sweetest things to do with this deck is going to be casting Involuntary Employment, stealing an opponent's creature, and then sacrificing their creature one way or another. In this deck, most frequently, that's going to be to a casualty spell. We've also got Pugnacious Pugilist, we've already seen, gives you 2 bodies, and that's always good sacrifice fodder. And Devil Tokens in general are going to be sweet sacrifice fodder because they also do something when they die. Unlucky Witness, when it dies, you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library, exile them actually, and you can play one of them. So it's another card that gives you something when it dies. We already saw Cormella. She can return a card to your graveyard, from your graveyard to your hand, an instant or sorcery in particular. Corrupt Court Official, a lot of its value comes from its Enter the Battlefield ability, so it's very expendable. Girder Goons gives you 2 separate bodies that can potentially be used. And I also have it here to sort of stand in for any card with Blitz. It's going to be expensive, but sometimes you can blitz a creature in, get the value out of it, and then in your second main phase, sacrifice the blitz creature to a card with casualty, and that's going to give you a ton of value because you get to draw a card. I mean, obviously, you need to be casting some of the cheaper ones to do it, but because they're going to die anyway, even giving up Girder Goons to cast like a casualty 1 spell is pretty good value. There's also Join the Maestros, a card with casualty, but one that also makes you a couple of tokens that can be pretty expendable. Let's look at the rares now. We've got Maestro's Ascendancy. So this really sums up this group pretty well because it simultaneously lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard and lets you sacrifice a creature. You have to pay the cost of the spell still, but if you can sack a creature in play to cast something from your graveyard, you're going to get some good value, and this deck is already loaded up with sacrifice fodder, so that works out pretty well. You've got the leader of this group. I do think he's the weakest in Limited of these 5 leaders, but he does have a pretty powerful trigger when he dies, which is that you make your opponent sacrifice half of the non-land permanents. He is pretty expensive and definitely not ideal, but I have him here because he's the Maestro's leader, and he does have a little bit of synergy with the mechanic. Maestro's Diabolist is pretty sweet. It gives you a devil token when it attacks, assuming you don't already have a devil token, and obviously those are expendable. Cut Your Losses. So, this is a card that I don't think is particularly good in this format. Milling your opponent is just not a great strategy. Paying 6 and not affecting the board, but in fact subtracting from your board with casualty 2 isn't usually what you want to do. But if you end up in a really controlling version of this deck, there's some potential for it to be a win condition. And obviously this is the best deck for it because you can give up meaningless things and get value out of them when you sacrifice it. I wouldn't go into the format actually playing the card, but this is probably the best deck for it. Also the best deck for Errant Street Artist. She lets you copy spells that weren't cast, and that means casualty cards. So you can get like 3 copies of things that you cast, which is kind of absurd. Body Launderer. This is a card with, actually has the Obscura mechanic, which is Connive, and we'll get to that later. But when he dies, he also reanimates something. So he's a good thing to sacrifice. Cut of the Prophets is a rare draw spell with casualty. Sanguine Spy gives you more payoffs for sacrificing creatures. It lets you surveil, basically, and then it can also potentially draw you extra cards. There's also Obnixilis, the Adversary, a super powerful planeswalker with casualty, and you get a copy of Obnixilis. He's not an instant or sorcery like everything else that has casualty, but you get a copy of this planeswalker, and it has loyalty equal to the power of whatever you sacrificed. He's absurdly powerful, and this is the best deck for him. So, just like we did a minute ago, where we looked at citizens, which are sort of part of what's going on within the Cabaretti more broadly, we're going to look now at black-red, and specifically at sacrifice, with less of an emphasis on spells, but still a big emphasis on the idea of sacrificing things. Here, the signpost uncommon I'm showing you is Forge Boss. Anytime you sack one or more creatures, it does 2 damage to each opponent. That can add up. I mean, you can only do it once a turn, but there's enough ways to sacrifice with all the casualty spells we just saw and other sacrifice things that this will chip in for a lot of damage. There's some other things you can do too. You've got Fatal Grudge, which gives you a way to sacrifice something, usually something that's pretty meaningless, and also make your opponent sacrifice something, hopefully something that's more meaningful, and you draw a card. And then Body Dropper is the common, and it gets a counter every time you sack a creature, and it can sacrifice creatures and gain menace. And then there's 2 uncommons that slot into this deck nicely. There is Dusk Mangler, which can allow you to sacrifice creatures when you cast it, and there's Pyre Sledge Arsonist, which is one of the most powerful sacrifice payoffs around, and not just for this deck. I'll explain what I mean later. We'll see this card again, because it counts any kind of permanent. It doesn't only count creatures like everything else, so it can do a ton of damage. If you're sacrificing a bunch of things, it's a great card to have around. So, that's black-red. It is a sacrifice deck. It focuses less on spells. It's more aggressive overall, I would say, than what we saw in Maestros more broadly. But again, all this stuff can also just sort of slot into a Maestros deck and still be pretty good. Let's move now to the Riveteers, which is an aggro deck focused on the Blitz mechanic. The Riveteers are the red, black, green crime family. We have a few cards here. I've got Mr. Orfeo the Boulder. He doubles the power of a creature when you attack. So obviously that's about doing a bunch of damage. Crew Captain, just a 4/2 that's indestructible when it comes into play and has haste, so it attacks really well. And then Blitz, it's something we've seen a few times already. We've seen this Pugnacious Pugilist before, but Blitz lets you cast a creature for an alternate cost, give it haste, and most of the cards with Blitz do something either when they die. Well, they all draw you a card when they die. It's part of the mechanic, but they all do something when they attack or when they die, giving you some sort of additional value, like the Pugilist, who makes this 1/1 Devil token right away. I do want to look at the Blitz mechanic in particular because I think it's at the heart of what this deck is trying to do. This deck is just an aggro deck. It plays some beefier creatures than Cabaretti does. So it's a little, stompier in the mid game, but it is a deck about attacking with your creatures. I mean, the mechanic in this case is built entirely around attacking with your creatures as soon as possible because of Blitz. Some of the things with Blitz, all the things with Blitz really, do something aggressive. There's not really like a passive Blitz card, and that would be weird because they all want you to be attacking. You have things like Mayhem Patrol, which is basically a 2-mana 2/2 menace at worst. And when you blitz it, you can offer the power to something else. You can always do that actually, but blitzing it into play with menace and then adding power somewhere is going to add a bunch of damage to the board, and then you draw a card. Plasma Jockey makes something unable to block, which is very aggressive. Pugnacious Pugilist adds 2 bodies to the board that are both attacking right away. Riveteers Requisitioner is a 2-mana 3/1 that you can blitz in and get a treasure from. You get the treasure either way, but that's the value it gives you immediately if you do blitz it. Nightclubber makes it so all of your opponent's stuff is weaker and less effective at blocking and will outright kill some things. Girder Goons gives you 2 bodies. Calladia Strongarm can add counters to the board. Riveteers Decoy makes it so something has to block it. So almost all of these, I guess the Requisitioner is maybe the one exception, almost all of them do something pretty aggressive as part of their effect. And so that's why this deck is really built around blitzing things in, getting value out of it, and just killing your opponent reasonably quickly. Here are rares that fit well into this deck. You've got Ognis the Dragon's Lash, who cranks out treasure anytime a creature with haste attacks. All your blitzed creatures have haste, so you're going to get treasure out of them. Jaxis the Troublemaker comes with Blitz, and she also comes with the powerful ability to make token copies of another target creature you control and basically give them Blitz. They'll have haste, and when they die, you get to draw a card, and then the creature gets sacrificed. So Jaxis has Blitz and is sort of a Blitz, can give Blitz to anything almost. Tenacious Underdog has Blitz. It can come out of the graveyard using its Blitz ability. Workshop Warchief, another card with Blitz that gives you insane value. Ziatora's Envoy, another blitzer who gives you a bunch of value because if you blitz it in, you're not only drawing a card, but you're probably also getting a card from the top of your library. And then there's the leader of this group, Ziatora. She's interesting because she's not, she doesn't have Blitz outright, but Blitz creatures are pretty expendable, and she can sacrifice things, including Blitz creatures and the extra bodies they bring with them, to generate treasure and do damage to things. There's also Riveteers Ascendancy, which anytime you sacrifice a creature, which is what the Blitz cards do, you may return target creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Do this once each turn. So you can reanimate things when you sacrifice things. Another thing to keep in mind is that the black-red sacrifice stuff we just looked at, which slots into Maestros, also slots in pretty well here because all of these Blitz creatures sacrifice themselves. So it is the color pair that is parallel to these two, both the Maestros and the Riveteers. There is another color pair contained within this 3-color group, and that is red-green, and that's another one of these allied color decks, and it's a treasure deck. So treasure is going to be part of the Riveteers decks in general, but red-green itself and the gold cards that red-green in particular has are focused on doing stuff with treasure, like Security Rocks here, who you can pay only 2 mana for if you spend treasure mana to cast it, and it's a 5/4, so that's a pretty good deal. The other treasure payoffs you get are Stimulus Package, which makes treasure, and then also lets you give up treasure to make citizen creature tokens. I like the look of this card a lot because eventually, if you're making a bunch of treasure, it stops serving a whole lot of purpose, but Stimulus Package can make sure your treasure adds to the board, and Jetmir's Fixer also gives you something to do with all your treasure because it has an ability that pumps it, and if you use treasure to pay for it, it adds permanently in the form of a +1/+1 counter. There's also a couple of other support cards. Capenna Express can be crewed basically by sacrificing an artifact creature, or rather a treasure. It becomes an artifact creature. Courier's Briefcase makes you a little citizen token. It is a treasure, and then this deck is good enough at making treasure that you can actually generate the 5 mana it needs to draw 3, which is pretty powerful. And here's Pyre Sledge Arsonist. I actually think it's better in this deck than it is in the black-red deck or in Maestros, and that's because treasure are easier to sacrifice than creatures, generally speaking. They come with the word sacrifice on them, and you don't have to pay any mana for them. So the Arsonist can be kind of insane if you're generating treasure, because you can like pay 4 mana to cast some, let's say your Capenna Express, and then pay 1 mana and tap your Arsonist to do 4 to anything. So that's pretty absurd. It's a very powerful card, and this is probably the best deck for it. There's also, it's sort of a minor one, but Paragon of Modernity. If you have a bunch of treasure, it's sort of like a bad version of Jetmir's Fixer. You can add permanently to it. If you're adding mana of 3 different colors when you pay for its ability, it gets a counter. So here are the rares that fit into this deck. You've got Black Market Tycoon, who generates treasure. You've got Ginny Fae. This is something I missed in the set review, as people pointed out in the comments. This doesn't only count creature tokens, it counts treasures too. So it does a really good job of being in both the Cabaretti deck and in the red-green/Riveteers deck, because turning your treasure into creatures is even better in most situations than turning a 1/1 token into one of these creatures. I've also got Meeting of the Five here. It's probably unplayable, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one because it can generate all this nonsense mana. And, the problem with the card is in Limited, it's going to be very hard to end up with a deck construction that has all of these 3-color spells that you can actually play. But if there's a deck for it, it will be this one. But I would shy away from actually playing this in Limited. Bootlegger's Stash can generate a bunch of treasure. This is pretty much the only deck for it. Again, you can be in a Riveteers deck that's treasure focused, so that could work too. But these 2 decks are really the only place where that makes sense, because by the time you play this, you don't really need a million treasure. But as we've already seen, there's lots of things you can do with treasure. Like if you have Ginny Fae in play along with Bootlegger's Stash, good luck to your opponent. There's also Horde Hauler, which can generate treasure if your opponent has artifacts when it hits them. Professional Facebreaker gives you treasure tokens when a creature does combat damage to a player, and you can give up treasure, something else to do with them, to exile the top card of your library, and you can play it until end of turn. There's also Structural Assault. I feel like this card is probably a little too difficult to make work, even in this deck, kind of like Meeting of the Five, but this is probably the deck for it. If you can pay 5 treasure, sack it, and do 5 to the whole board, that sounds pretty good. The problem is, having that treasure around, first of all, is far from a guarantee, and second of all, it's a symmetrical sweeper, so the situations where you can actually use it are even more narrow. But, again, kind of like with Meeting of the Five, this is the best deck for it. Also the best deck for Widespread Thieving, the Red Hideaway enchantment. Not only does it generate treasure for you every time you cast a multicolored spell, but you can pay 5, 1 mana of each color, that is, Wooburg mana. And if you do, you can play the Hidden Away spell for free. So this deck is going to have the easiest time already making treasure. It also has the most things to do with treasure, and it can produce the mana this thing needs so that you can get a card out of it. So definitely the best deck for it. So that's red-green. It's a treasure deck. It's got some sacrifice stuff going on and some multicolored stuff going on. And it's also the deck that's going to be the easiest to play like 5 colors with, which, also means you can splash all kinds of things. All right, let's move now to Obscura, where you're ending up in the most controlling deck in the format. You've got cards like Quasar, Augur of Agonies, which says whenever you draw a card, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And that pairs really well with the Obscura mechanic, which is Connive, which you can see on Psychic Pickpocket here. Connive is a neat mechanic. It's one that allows you to loot, but then gives you some modality over how things go. If you discard a non-land card, the creature that is conniving gets a +1/+1 counter. And if you don't discard a non-land, which means you discard a land, it's just a normal loot. So you can sometimes decide whether you want like an immediate boost on one of your creatures, or you want to do something different and end up with something that's not a land in your hand. But the deck's game plan, it revolves around these controlling elements, but it also has a lot of things that it can discard for value. And there's also some +1/+1 counter stuff going on as well, because this gives you counters. Nimble Arsonist is here. It doesn't synergize in any special way with Connive like Quasar does, but it is sort of a good card that represents what the deck is about. It disrupts and controls your opponent in an ideal world. I do want to take a look at Connive because it's a new mechanic, a different mechanic, and I think it's very central to what this deck is doing, so I need to look at it significantly in this video. You've got cards like Illuminator Virtuoso, which when it becomes the target of a spell you control, connives. It's a little awkward. It almost feels like it's probably better in an aggro deck, but it does connive. Rafine's Informant, I think, is more what this deck is looking for, though. Just a creature that you can add to the board that connives, and that lets you, load your graveyard. It lets you play a more efficient creature. I mean, this is a 2-mana 3/2 in some situations, and that's pretty nice. Echo Inspector, another creature that just connives when it enters the battlefield, so you either get a 4-mana 3/4 with flying, or a 4-mana 2/3 that gave you a card to replace a land. Both pretty decent options. Hypnotic Grifter, if you have enough mana around, you can just sink a ton of it into this, and it can just connive as many times as it wants, provided, every time you have 3 mana, each 3 mana you have can let you connive once, which is pretty powerful. Psionic Snoop is, I think, one of the less exciting ones because it's just sort of poorly statted and neither option feels great, but it's another creature with enter the battlefield connive. We already saw the Pickpocket, which bounces something and connives. Security Bypass, not a card I love, but it is a way to connive repeatedly. Rafine's Silencer connives, and the bigger it gets, the better it is when it dies. So putting the counter on it is going to be appealing a lot of the time. Revel Ruiner, a 4-mana creature that can be a 3/1 with Menace that lets you get rid of a land and draw a real card, or a 4-mana 4/2 with Menace. So what are the connive payoffs? Well, there's a few different ways you can go. You have cards that pay you off for drawing cards, like Quasar. So you're drawing extra cards every time you connive. And so no matter which option you choose with connive, that is going to drain your opponent. And that is a very real win condition in this deck. Similarly, Fairy Vandal gets a counter every time you draw your second card a turn, which you can do with connive. There are also ways to get value back from your graveyard, so you can discard things that you want to get back later. For example, a big creature that you can then reanimate with Graveyard Shift, which is going to be pretty easy to do in this deck overall. You're probably not going to be super great at getting it flash. That's going to be maybe a bit of a challenge, but it also sort of synergizes with the deck. Maybe you get those mana values in your graveyard because you're discarding the right things. But I think the most value comes from this card just by discarding some big creature you want to reanimate to connive, and then you just get it back. And so you turn discarding it not only into a counter, but an additional advantage. Maestro's Initiate we've seen already. It's nice to connive because you can still get value from the graveyard. Rogue's Gallery, this lets you just discard whatever you want, and then you can reanimate a bunch of it. Not reanimate, but return it to your hand later. Dig Up the Body, similarly, lets you return things you might have discarded. Patch Up lets you reanimate things, so if you're discarding smaller creatures that you can get back anyway, you can just patch up later and not really lose the value. Rafine's Guidance, this is going to be an interesting one. It, to me, feels like it doesn't quite do enough, but discarding it for a counter and then later in the game bringing it back as an aura definitely is a thing. Expendable Lackey, we saw that it works in Maestros. It works here too because you can discard it and then still get a token out of it. Halo Scarab, similarly, you can get treasure out of it even after it's in your graveyard. So what rares fit in well here? Well, we've got Tenacious Underdog again. That's a card that you can discard that just keeps coming back, so you don't really lose a whole lot by discarding Tenacious Underdog to Connive. You've got Ledger Shredder, which has Connive, and it connives every time a second spell is played during a player's turn. You've got the leader of the group, who has a huge connive effect, Connive X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. You've got Toulouse, Clever Conductor, which can turn your conniving and discarding in general into an effect that can allow you to just return all those cards to your hand in the end if you give up Toulouse one way or another, whether it's by sacrificing her or trading her or whatever. Extraction Specialist, another card that can enable you to discard like a cheap creature and then play Extraction Specialist and just bring it back. All-Seeing Arbiter is a mythic that doesn't connive, but it does let you draw and discard cards, and it has an effect that likes for cards to be in the graveyard. Body Launderer, we already saw, he can connive over and over again, every time a creature dies, and then he reanimates something that's not a rogue with power less than or equal to his. So, discarding him, or rather, discarding other things means you can get them back later with Body Launderer. So, once again, we're going to move now to an allied color pair that's sort of contained within this one, and this one is blue-black, which is focused on the graveyard. The whole connive thing is a little more complicated because you're doing stuff with counters. This deck is more focused on the graveyard aspect, and in particular, there's a bunch of cards with like a pseudo-threshold effect. Threshold originally was an effect that said if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, this card gets better somehow or another. In this case, it looks specifically at 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard, and then you get a bonus, like Syndicate Infiltrator here, who becomes a 4-mana 5/5 flyer if you've met that requirement. Obviously, Connive helps you achieve this, and again, just like the others, you can play these cards, a lot of them, just in a 3-color deck, but this color pair, if you sort of zoom in on it a little more, focus in on it a little more, is even more focused on the graveyard side of things. So, yeah, Connive can set up the cards in your graveyard. You also have some self-mill you're interested in. So, these are some of the cards with this threshold effect. You've got the Infiltrator, we already saw. Tainted Indulgence lets you draw cards and then discard a card, which itself can help you set up 2/5 of this pseudo-threshold effect. And then, once you've achieved that effect, this just turns into a 2-mana draw 2, which is incredible. Snooping Newsy, similarly, mills you, so helps set up your effect in the first place. And then once you get there, it gets +1/+1 in lifelink. We've also already seen Graveyard Shift. This deck is probably more likely to turn on the flash on this card, but it's good for the same reasons. Sewer Crocodile is not the most exciting payoff ever, but it's kind of a reasonable win condition in a deck that can consistently make it unblockable for 1 blue. And then there's also a rare, Aven Heartstabber, which becomes a 3/3 with Death Touch when you have those 5 or more cards with different mana values in your graveyard. And when it dies, you mill 2 cards and then draw a card. So it can help you set up these other cards as well. So that's blue-black. It's about the graveyard. It's sort of a sub-theme already contained within Obscura, but it's sort of a more focused graveyard deck. All those cards that mill you are going to be a little better in this kind of deck than in an Obscura deck. So let's move now to the Brokers, which are white, blue, green. This faction's mechanic is shield counters, which you can see on Disciplined Duelist. If a creature has a shield counter, if it's dealt damage or destroyed, you remove a shield counter instead of those things happening. There's also a smaller +1/+1 counter theme within the deck, and Lagrella the Magpie is an example of this. You can use it to exile any number of other target creatures controlled by different players when it enters the battlefield. And that wording is horrible. It was, a lot of people talked about it on Twitter. It's hard to understand because they didn't word it well. But basically, you can exile 1 creature you control and 1 creature your opponent controls with it until Lagrella leaves the battlefield. So it's like a Banisher Priest that exiles an opposing creature, but you also have the upside of maybe exiling something that has an enter the battlefield shield counter, and then when Lagrella does die, and your opponent probably wants to kill her because you remove their best creature, when she does die, you then get that thing back with counters, plus the shield counter, like if you exile your Disciplined Duelist, who no longer has their counter. But you can also exile all kinds of other things with enter the battlefield abilities. But shield counters are the thing here. The cards with it, like Swooping Protector, if you just look at this as a 4-mana 2/1 with flash and flying, that doesn't seem very good. But the shield counters are a big deal. I mean, your opponent they have to give up something to make the first shield counter fall off. Even if it's just blocking with a token, even if it's just using an activated ability, your opponent has to use resources more than once on these things to deal with them, even in combat. And so these shield counters are pretty powerful, and they make this deck into a creature deck, though more of a mid-rangey one that seeks to win by basically generating card advantage and mana advantage, in the sense that these shield counter creatures are such a pain. And Swooping Protector, for example, you can flash in and block something with it and kill it if it's an X2, and then your Protector's still around. You know, that's what these shield counters can do. And sure, it's a 4-mana 2/1 with flying. That's not the most exciting thing ever, but it just killed something. So that's pretty exciting. You've got Boon of Safety, which can put a shield counter on a creature at instant speed, which is going to be obnoxious in this deck. Wing Shield Agent, another one of these shield counter creatures. This one has sort of an aggressive attack trigger, in that you can attack with it, and then another target creature gains flying until end of turn. And a 3-mana 2/3 with a shield counter already looks pretty good. And a lot of these shield counter creatures do something when they attack, or make something happen that your opponent probably doesn't want to happen again. So if you just gave flying to your big green creature with this, and your opponent has to interact with the Windshield Agent twice to get rid of it. Now, there are aura-based removal spells, and those get around these things. There's even a red removal spell that just turns off shield counters, but typically in this format, they're still going to be tough to deal with. Broker's Veteran, we've seen it puts a shield counter on something when it dies. Prize Fight is less obviously good with shield counters, but it's good with shield counter creatures because you can fight with them, and they survive, while the opposing creature probably doesn't. If you're targeting it with the fight spell, it won't, because why else would you be doing it? Rock's Pummeler is a huge shield counter creature that has trample as long as it has its shield counter. So it's another one where, you know, just throwing a token in front of it's not really going to do the job, because it's going to trample over for a ton of damage and then attack you again the next turn. Take to the Streets. So you have access to a bunch of citizens in this color pair as well, and ways to make tokens. But it synergizes with shield counters in a way, because you can pump your whole board, attack with everything, and if like 2 or 3 of your creatures have shield counters, your opponent's situation is not going to be a good one, because they probably have to block some of your stuff, and those creatures don't really care if they get blocked. Voice of the Vermin, it's sort of like Wing Shield Agent in that it makes another creature, or itself, in the case of the voice, into a better attacker when it attacks, and getting that trigger, guaranteeing more or less, but you get that trigger more than once because of the shield counter, is pretty powerful. So what are the rares for this group? Well, you've got Rigo, Streetwise Mentor. It enters with a shield counter. It also works well with citizen tokens, since it draws you a card every time you attack a player or planeswalker with 1 or more creatures with power 1 or less, so those tokens are great for that. We've also got Falco Spara, the leader of this group. It's a 4-mana 3/3 with flying, trample, and a shield counter, and you can also give up any kind of counter, but in this deck more often than not, shield counters, to cast cards from the top of your library, which is pretty powerful. Broker's Ascendancy puts counters on your whole board, quite powerful as well. Elspeth Resplendent, I mean, she's going to be good in every white deck ever, but she does have an effect that involves a shield counter, her -3 effect, so that matters. Same thing with Sanctuary Warden, huge bomb, but it does come into play with 2 shield counters, and you can remove counters from things to put a 1/1 creature token into play. Undercover Operative is a clone that if it clones one of your creatures gets a shield counter. And there's also Depopulate. You know, this card's going to be interesting to see how it pans out, but chances are good that if you're the Broker's player, you'll have more shield counters than your opponent, and that makes Depopulate more often not blow up all of your stuff and blow up more of theirs. Now, if you're up against someone else with shield counters, that's not going to feel very good, and you do let them draw a card in most situations because there's so many multicolored cards in the set, but this is probably the best deck for Depopulate. All right, so we've only got one deck left. It's our last allied color pair, and it's one that's contained within both Brokers and Obscura, and it's blue-white. And this is the color pair where you have the overlap of +1/+1 counters from Connive and shield counters from the Brokers. So this deck doesn't care what kind of counter you're talking about. It likes them all. And we saw a few cards like that within Brokers. So once again, yes, all this stuff can just fit into a Brokers deck too. But blue-white is less focused on one particular kind of counter than Brokers are more broadly. And Metropolis Angel shows you that whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures with counters on them, you draw a card. So you get to draw a card anytime a creature, at least one creature, attacks with a counter on it. And you're going to have access, again, lots of shield counters, lots of +1/+1 counters from Connive. The other ones, you know, we've got the Angel. We've also got Exotic Pets, which gives you 2/1/1 unblockable creatures. And then you can put, generally, in this deck, you're going to put a shield counter on one and a +1/+1 counter on another. pretty good value for 3. Celestial Regulator, tap something down when it enters no matter what, but it freezes it down during it until its controller's next untap step if you have a counter somewhere. Backstreet Bruiser likes it when you have 2 or more counters among creatures you control because it loses Defender. And Revelation of Power is a nice combat trick that gets better if you have a counter on that creature. So those are the archetypes. The 3-color families are more well supported. They're calling them, in their articles about this set, those are the primary archetypes, and the secondary archetypes are these 2-color ones. I think more often than not, you'll end up in like a 3-color deck, but there'll be times where 2 colors are open enough and you get enough payoffs for, like if you get a lot of these commons and uncommons, might not be a lot of reason to reach into green because they all synergize so well together. But I do think you usually end up in a 3-color deck in this format. But it's good to know that there are these 2-color options as well. And it's also good to know that you can start by drafting one of these 2-color options and then sort of figure out where you're going from there, since they tend to overlap into 2 different crime families. So those are my thoughts on the archetypes and Streets of New Capenna. This new format looks pretty neat, and I'm excited to start drafting it. I'll start streaming drafts next week once it goes live on Arena, and that also means draft videos will be going up on the channel. Every Saturday, I also post a vlog where I talk about limited Magic, and you can expect the next several weeks to talk about this brand new format. So, subscribe if you want access to all of that. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.